Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And welcome to the 2025 Lillian Smith Book Award ceremony. Just a couple of things before we start the evening. I am the only person that will be here past 8 o'clock this evening with a Grandmaster key and an alarm code. The other half of the Georgia Center for the Book, unfortunately, is at home taking care of a sick toddler. So if we do go past the 8 o'clock hour with the book signing and things like that, we'll exit through the glass doors and up the blue stairs to get to the upper parking deck. Other than that, we may have to wait a couple minutes for me to get a group together to go up the elevator and out the doors, if you need to do that as well. Also, the signing, of course, will be in the meeting room across the way. There was a corkboat regatta in there earlier this afternoon from the children's department. So there is a giant wading pool over in there right now. So if you see me duck off the stage during the presentations, it is because the children's librarian has arrived downstairs from teaching the sewing class upstairs, and we are going to take away the inflatable pool that is in the signing room currently. Libraries in 2025. I'm hoping that the corkboat regatta had something to do with science. But who knows nowadays. Right now, I would like to bring up Charles Johnson, who is going to tell you about the Lillian Smith Book Awards and get our ceremony off to a start this evening. Charles?
Good evening. I'm Charles Johnson. I am president of the Southern Regional Council. And I want to welcome you to this 57th annual presentation of the Lillian Smith Book Awards. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background on what brings us here today. Let me take you back to the period just after the Second World War, when many people in the South were charting a cautious course on racial change and calling for a more humane form of segregation. It was Lillian Smith, nearly alone among white Southern thought leaders, who boldly and persistently articulated an entirely different vision of a South that was completely free of segregation. And after her death in 1968, the Southern Regional Council established an annual award in her name to recognize authors whose work carries on the tradition of Lillian Smith, work of outstanding literary merit and moral vision, which at the same time honestly portrays the South, its people, its problems, and its promises. And in this era, when reality itself has become contested ground, and when merely telling the whole truth about the world in which we live can be an act of resistance, our mission and our work are as relevant as ever. And so for the last several years, this award has been presented as a partnership between the Southern Regional Council, which originated the award, the University of Georgia Libraries, which house the Lillian Smith papers, and the Georgia Center for the Book, which for years has presented the Decatur Book Festival. Now, there are many people who have had a hand in bringing this award to you every year, and including this year, but I want to give special recognition to our heroic and distinguished panel of jurors who worked their way through the 84 books that were nominated this year. And some of them are here today, some of them are not. Not with us today is Dr. Winifred Johnson at Bethune-Cookman University, and from the University of Delaware, not here today, is Minion Casey Morrison, but several of our jurors are here today. So from the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia, we have Merrill Penson, who is here. Raise your hands and be recognized. from the Atlanta Fulton Public Library, James Taylor is here. Please raise your hand and be recognized. And from Tennessee State University, we have Dr. Melvin Johnson, who was here. So please thank me for thanking all of our jurors as well as all of our institutional partners. Now, this year's award recipients are very much in the tradition of Lillian Smith and of all of our previous honorees. Our first recipient is Robert Cohen. Robert Cohen is a professor of history and social studies at NYU's Steiner School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His historical scholarship focuses on politics, higher education, and social protest in 20th century America. And we honor him today for his book, Confronting Jim Crow, Race, Memory, and the University of Georgia in the 20th Century. In his book, Professor Cohen explores the University of Georgia's struggle to overcome its long and troubled racial history, shedding light on white Georgia's historical amnesia concerning the university's role in sustaining the state's system of Jim Crow. The book extends the historical analysis beyond the desegregation crisis of 1961 and through the lens of Black and white students, faculty, and administration perspectives. The book exposes the enduring impact of Jim Crow and its lingering effects on the storied Athens campus. And so, it's my pleasure to present a 2025 Lillian Smith Book Award to Professor Cohen for unearthing hidden truths about a story with which many of us thought we were familiar. Professor Cohen.
Thank you.
I want to make sure this is the right one.
No.
This one has your name on it. And hopefully you've been working out because this is kind of heavy.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. Let me put this down over here. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for this honor. First of all, it's an honor to be here with Crystal Sanders, whose book I love, and I hope you all read. Also, because this honors Lillian Smith, it's a special meaning to me because I've always admired her. And just finished a book on Dr. King called Not Dreaming, Martin Luther King's Critique of America. And I know that he and Lillian Smith were friends. And so this award means a lot to me. I just want to, before I get started on my text, I want to thank my colleagues, my former colleagues in the University of Georgia History Department, the late Bill McFilley, John Insko, Robert Pratt, and more recently, Chana Kiley and Scott Nesbitt, also late Tom Dyer. There was, when I was at Georgia, a community of, I guess you'd say, dissident scholars who were trying to take an honest, critical look at Georgia history and the University of Georgia. So I'm grateful for that community, as well as outside the history department, Maurice Daniels in social work, who later on became the dean there. Not only did books around it, biographies of people like Donald Hollowell and Judge Hartsward, but also a documentary film. So I'm really part of the movement, I think, not a solo actor. I was thinking on the way here, as I was reflecting on the book, that it has a kind of terrible relevancy. And by that I mean that somebody who studied this history, this tragic history of racism and the heroic struggle against it, seems increasingly relevant because of what's been going on in this country for the last few years especially. I'm reminded how Dr. King would often talk about racism as a kind of sickness. And in his last speech in Memphis, He talked about the racist mayor of Memphis, Mayor Loeb, being sick with racism and being callous towards the sanitation workers who were on strike. And he said that the mayor, Loeb, is in dire need of a doctor. And I have to say that when I see the current president of the United States talking about race, I feel the same way. Some things that just don't get talked about anymore, like when he was slandering Haitian immigrants as eating the dogs and the cats of the people who live there, and talking about Springfield, Ohio, as if they're not people. And that's just, we could spend the whole night talking about that. But I think it really shows that we need to have a serious engagement with understanding the history of racism and its persistence. Because this is not a marginal issue. We're in an age of white grievance politics, white nationalism, and a kind of attempt to erase black history, and from the very top of the administration in Washington. So I think this is more important than ever. But I just want to say, too, it's not just a problem with the president. It's this plurality of support that he had. And the way I understand it, there's a scholar of Nazi Germany named Ian Kershaw, who talked about public opinion in Nazi Germany. Not that most people were not fanatical, genocidal Nazis, but many, many more were morally indifferent. And that's what I see in this country right now. So I hope that both my book and Crystal's get read and that we can push back on this. So that's just a preface to what I want to say tonight. In titling my book on UGA and race, Confronting Jim Crow, I had several ironies in mind. We have time today to explore only the most obvious irony, which applies to the white side of the Jim Crow color line. Because almost nobody at UGA in the first 60 years of the 20th century proved willing and able to confront Jim Crow, to publicly criticize legally ordained racial segregation and anti-black discrimination in the segregated South, or to object to bigoted ideas, or even to the shockingly crude racist language in UGA student publications in the Jim Crow era. Why? A state and campus-wide segregationist consensus, check. Peer pressure from classmates and threats of censorship from powerful Georgia politicians and UGA officials against students who criticize segregation, check. A lack of academic freedom for faculty to question segregation, check. A curriculum that either condescended to or ignored blacks and their history, check. Since we are here tonight at the ceremony honoring Lillian Smith, one of the white Georgia's, as you said, few prominent critics of Jim Crow, let me take an example from UGA's history that involves her. Back in 1955, a liberal UGA philosophy professor, Paul Fetzer, dared to criticize Jim Crow. Fetzer, a Quaker pacifist, had written to Representative Adam Clayton Powell, Congress's one of its most prominent, maybe the most prominent black civil rights advocate in Congress at the time, and he praised Powell for his stance against conscription and against racial discrimination and segregation. Impressed by getting this kind of letter from someone from the University of Georgia, surprised, he read it into the congressional record. Whoa. When that became public, Fetzer became the target of a harassment campaign by his dean. Though Fetzer had a divinity degree, a doctorate from Yale, and was the UGA Philosophy Department's chair and its most well-published scholar, he was shaken by the dean's offensive against him, realizing that his job was in danger. So in July of 1955, Fetzer wrote to his friend Lillian Smith describing the situation and asking her for her advice and support. He told, in that letter to Smith, he told Lillian Smith that he was summoned to the dean's office and read the Riot Act, making it clear that he was persona non grata and that he could expect no increases in rank or salary, nor further support for our department until he resigned or kept silent or rolled over and played dead. The dean even threatened to get rid of the philosophy department if they could not get rid of me, Fetzer wrote, in other ways. Smith's response to her friend Fetzer was impressive and depressing. Impressive because of Smith's quick and sympathetic response. She wrote a letter immediately, like a long letter in response right away. Depressing because Fetzer, who thought pressure to purge him, which originated from segregation, he thought the segregationist politicians in Atlanta were responsible for this attempt to purge him. He was hoping that because Lillian Smith was a famous author, she might be able to put some pressure to find out who in Atlanta had put this pressure on this dean of the school to get rid of him, and maybe that pressure could be used to stop the purge. But Lillian Smith had no such contacts. As she explained, "I have no powerful friends. I am far more hated than you and feared by all those people." She urged him not to resign, and that if it came to it, to make UGA fire him, so that she and the ACLU, and she was on its board, could publicize the university's crushing of anti-racist dissent. Fetzer agreed to try to hang on, writing that, quote, "It is a matter of simple justice, of whether we are going to make democracy really work or lose it by default," something a lot of us are thinking about these days. But he became worn down and fed up with UGA's hostile work environment, the repressive Jim Crow ethos that rendered his colleagues timid and cautious and fearful under the constant pounding of the extremists. Those are his words, timid and cautious and fearful under the constant pounding of extremists. So in 1959, he decided he could take no more, and he left UGA for Vassar College, where he became a much admired and beloved professor of religion and philosophy until his retirement. This repressive environment, which drove Fetzer out of Georgia, rendered faculty fearful of speaking out publicly against Jim Crow, or teaching about the system's oppression of African Americans, or doing much of anything in their classes to challenge their students' white supremacist assumptions. Even though it had been decades since America's leading social scientists, such as Otto Kleinberg, had refuted the racist myths denigrating black intelligence, such myths persisted in UGA's student body, which was really disconnected from modern scholarship on race. And that includes the elite of Georgia, like people like the Talmadges and Vandiver. They weren't learning modern social science in their classes, or if they were, it was going out one ear and out the other. The result was an astounding degree of ignorance among UGA students on race, integration, civil rights, black history, and on all the modern scholarship on those important topics. I encountered overwhelming evidence of this ignorance some 30 years ago in my initial research on UGA and race. This was my study published as a Georgia Historical Quarterly article in 1996, thanks to the brilliant editorship of John Insko, my friend in the history department there. It was a study of the essays a class of calculus students wrote about their views on UGA's integration a week after a racist riot rocked the university in its January 1961 integration crisis. Those 34 essays expressed just about every racist myth imaginable, from inherent black criminality to black intellectual inferiority, even blacks having abnormal skull sizes. It was just an incredible group of essays to read. And on civil rights, absurdly equating the NAACP with a communist plot to destroy America. Those essays also revealed that when students discussed the roots of their racial ideas, or really the roots of their racial miseducation really, it was almost always their family, their friends, and their communities on the white side of the color line. Their ignorance and bigotry were homegrown. 33 of the 34 students in that class cited nothing that they had learned at school or the university. There had been no educational intervention to challenge this racism. This was because UGA's curriculum was designed and taught by professors who were often afraid of racial controversy because their jobs would be at stake. This helps to explain how it could be that UGA became the site of a disgraceful student-organized race riot in alliance with the Ku Klux Klan outside of Charlene Hunter. She was the first African-American woman student outside of her dormitory in January 1961. A riot designed to rid UGA of Charlene and her fellow integrationist pioneer, Hamilton Holmes. And the riot was modeled on a previous riot years earlier at the University of Alabama that had rid the university of its first black student, Arthur and Lucy. And this riot occurred at Georgia the first night after Hamilton and Charlene had attended their first classes. And it took the entire Athens police force to suppress this riot, along with Dean Tate, who was injured in the melee, and it took tear gas as well to end the riot, and the State Patrol mysteriously never showed up. The lesson from this history for us today seems crystal clear, that the recent repressive legislation imposed on schools by numerous red states seeking to ban as divisive education on the history and legacy of racism, most notably in DeSantis' Florida, but also here in Georgia, and the Trump administration's agenda to censor African American history and cultural institutions like the Smithsonian is not going to make America great again. It's going to make Americans, especially students, ignorant again. UGA's Jim Crow experience offers us a warning that we must not return to the kind of racial miseducation that afflicted the Jim Crow South, but that certainly seems where we are headed, to a school world and society that are no more able to confront racism and Jim Crow's legacy than were the UGA students and faculty who I studied when UGA was a segregated university bereft of academic freedom. What is especially troubling about all this is that even before Trumpism, we were not doing all that well in this crucial area of education. In fact, back in 2011, on the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides and Bob Moses' courageous voting rights organizing in Mississippi, I asked Bob why he thought so few Americans knew of the work that he and SNCC had done in Mississippi between 1961 and 65, and the racist terrorism they had to overcome as they sought to end decades of black disenfranchisement. Bob replied, "The country does not do a good job of showing that the country's history is equally about the tough issues of slavery and Jim Crow as it is about revolution and freedom. America is inclined towards just really painting a facade over the history. So that's the problem." I realize that all this can be depressing when we reflect upon the world we are in today, with the White House wedded to white grievance politics, in which books like mine can so easily be dismissed or even banned from schools as woke. The work, in Trump's favorite demeaning phrase, of radical left lunatics. Having just last Thursday conducted a makeup class with my African American students who have been afraid to attend class, this is in New York, the prior week after racist death threats have been directed at NYU's black community as well as numerous HBCUs, it is difficult to be upbeat. All the more so because this is a time when demagogic politicians, including the president, insist that history should be little more than an exercise in flag-waving nationalism, or as Trump put it, a history designed to show that America is a hot country. But writing history to serve such narrow nationalistic aims is a dead end, especially if we consider political scientist Carl Deutsch's sobering words that a nation is, quote, a group of people united by a mistaken view of the past and a hatred of its neighbors. As I move towards my conclusion, I must push back on this tendency to despair in this era of cruelty, bigotry, and plutocracy. First, let's consider Toni Morrison's uplifting words. Speaking in another troubled time, after the videotaped police assault on Rodney King and the riots that ignited in LA in 1992, Morrison offered the University of Michigan's graduating class wise advice that I hope encourages us, reminding us of the value of our effort to pursue the truth in history, especially the history of racism and anti-racism, however unpopular that may be. She articulated a vision of honest, critical engagement with history that I hope is reflected in my research and writing on Jim Crow Georgia, and the Black-led struggle to liberate Georgia and UGA to democratize both, striving for justice in a political and educational system that lacked it. Toni Morrison explained that while it may be true that the future, your future, is in your hands, the past is also in your hands. Concentrating heavily on changing and managing the future, we don't realize the past is changeable as well. Of all the adages, the ones about refusing to cry over spilt milk, that life goes on, let the dead bury its dead, these sayings encourage us to get on with it and not to worry about yesterday or last year or last century. I disagree, wrote Morrison. History has a flexible side. Of course, it can be repeated disastrously or be reformed in new guises, but it can also be critiqued. It can be analyzed, and artists can reinvent it so it yields new information about itself, about the present as well as the future. And each time we critique and examine it, it can deliver other information and insight that in fact changes the way we know about it. That is the urgent enterprise these days when blood and rage bubble together in the streets. My point is, and this is a point that I hope we really remember, you are not bound by the future, and more important, you are not bound by the past. The past can be more liberating than the future if you're willing to identify its evasions, its distortions, its lies, and unleash its secrets and its truths. So, she concluded, I want to wish you not only the brightest of futures, but also the best of pasts. Earlier this month, my NYU students felt the power of these truths that Toni Morrison articulated, and so did I, in reacting to Charlene Hunter Galt's visit to our session exploring the history and lessons of UGA's integration crisis. In their journals and essays, the students commented upon how inspired they were to learn from Hunter Galt that even in difficult times, it was possible to persist in resisting racism and even to retain the optimistic conviction that, as MLK put it, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Or as Charlene told my students, it's not that we will endure, it's we shall overcome. Coming from Charlene, who together with Hamilton Holmes persisted and shattered UGA's color line, despite the racism directed at them even violently, her words came across not as sunny platitudes, but as historical truth learned and earned from experience. The timing of our session with Hunter Galt made the past seem alive and present, her insights prescient and even precious. As one of my students, a female African-American drama major, explained, just a few days before I saw the photo of the effigy in life, she's referring to a chilling image that conveyed the racism of a well-dressed UGA fraternity member who in January 1961's Life magazine photo that I had shown the class, and in my book, is seen smiling broadly while dangling a lynched black puppet on a string amidst the campus integration crisis. She continued, I even more felt the great significance of our conversation with Hunter Galt. On that same day, many HBCUs as well as NYU received threats of racist violence. It felt alarmingly cyclical. The reality is that these hateful ideas haven't gone away. They never did. The hatred today is directed at diversity, equity, and inclusion, my student wrote. I don't even think Charlene knows, but she comforted me in that moment. The student wrote, it was, she concluded, Charlene's optimism and keeping Hamilton's memory alive and honoring his achievements that I've held on to from her response to a question about the uncanny parallels between her experience in the early 60s and today's world. As the pendulum seems to be swinging back to the right in an attempt to cover up the impact of students like herself and Hamilton, Charlene continued to stress the importance of education and said that if they could overcome racism then, it could be done now, my student wrote. And I think that that's the key, she wrote. She would know better than anyone. Without my having to tell them, my students had learned that in Faulkner's words, the past is not dead, it's not even past. They had reflected on both the history and the endurance of racism, not just in the South. That there were lessons also about the possibilities of overcoming racism that were as meaningful in New York in 2025 for my students as they had been for Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes in Athens, Georgia in 1961. This left me hopeful that my students' rising generation of Americans could help pull us out of the Trump era with its censorship of black history, its crude politics of racial resentment, and its its blindness to anti-black racism, so that America could dare to do what my students, Charlene and Hamilton, had done, confronting Jim Crow and its legacy. And I hope my book will be of some use in that confrontation. Thank you.
Our next honoree is Crystal Sanders. Professor Sanders received her BA from Duke and her PhD in history from Northwestern, and having previously taught at Penn State, she now serves as an associate professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She is the author of the 26th book, A Chance for Change, Head Start and Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, for which she received a number of awards, including the 2017 Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association. We honor her today for her book, A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation Scholarships, and the Debt Owed to Public HBCUs. The book tells the little-known story of segregation scholarships awarded by states in the U.S. South to black students seeking graduate education in the era before Brown versus Board of Education. Professor Sanders examines black graduate students who relocated to the North, Midwest, and West to continue their education with these segregation scholarships, revealing the many challenges they faced along the way. In telling this story, Sanders demonstrates how white efforts to preserve segregation led to the underfunding of public black colleges, furthering racial inequality in American higher education. We're honored to present a 2025 Lillian Smith Book Award to Dr. Sanders for bringing to light a little-known story that needed to be told.
Good evening. I am absolutely honored to be one of the co-winners of the 2025 Lillian Smith Book Award. I'm thrilled that my co-winner is Robert Cohen, whose work on Spelman College and Howard Zinn I always assign in my classes. So it's a double honor. I want to begin by thanking the jurors who selected my book for recognition, and the Southern Regional Council, the University of Georgia Libraries, the DeKalb County Public Library, and the Georgia Center for the Book for sponsoring the award. I do not take it lightly to receive an honor named for Lillian Smith, who dared to tell the truth freely. She championed racial and social equality when few white people in both the North or the South spoke out. I am aware that this award does not just belong to me personally. When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in 1964, he remarked, and I quote, "Every time I take a flight, I'm always mindful of the many people who make a successful journey possible, the known pilots and the unknown ground crew." The known pilots and the unknown ground crew. As the author of A Forgotten Migration, I am the known pilot, but there was an unknown ground crew who got me here. I must thank my husband, Umomo, who has always supported in me, believed in me, and done anything possible to see me healthy, happy, and thriving. I'm also thankful for two of the most loving children ever, Victoria and Alexander, who told me that I was the best teacher and writer long before I won any awards. They are my own personal cheering squad and the reason why I remain committed to shining a light on educational inequality in our nation's history. I want my children to be able to reach their highest intellectual potential, and that is only possible if we dedicate ourselves to understanding the past and ensuring that we don't repeat it. My unknown ground crew also includes my parents, Nathaniel and Vel Sanders, who nurtured my love of history and believed in me before I believed in myself. It includes my in-laws, Uomadimo and Aduam Umomo, who always gave me an encouraging word and lifted me up in prayer. My mother-in-law, Aduam, passed away this past Friday in Nigeria. She literally helped me to get to the finish line. In full transparency, writing a book with 2 small kids was an obstacle that I was not sure I could overcome. I thought about giving up on this project several times, and in September of 2022, I literally almost gave up when I lacked childcare for my 7-month-old son. My mother-in-law did not count it robbery to come from Nigeria to Atlanta to keep my son so that I could finish this book. So today I'm a little, still dealing with this unexpected loss. My unknown ground crew got me to this destination. I also want to thank my sister Natalie, my Uncle Bill, and my Aunt Renee, and several other family members and friends for their support. Finally, I want to thank the Segregation Scholarship recipients and their descendants who so graciously answered my phone calls and my emails whenever I reached out to them. In many ways, Segregation Scholarship recipients are the unknown ground crew who opened the doors of post-baccalaureate study for Black Southerners. In pursuit of their own highest intellectual potential, they sought the warmth of other suns, enduring racism, social ostracism, financial hardship, and housing insecurity. To ensure that we're all on the same page, I will explain the term segregation scholarships. Even though more than 100 public and private Black colleges existed in the South during the era of legal segregation, training beyond the bachelor's degree was almost impossible. Before 1936, there were only 7 schools in the South, all private institutions, where African Americans could pursue graduate or professional school study. No Black institution conferred the PhD degree until 1955. While non-Black students could pursue master's, doctorate, and professional degrees at state-supported flagship institutions in the South, Black students remained shut out of these institutions because of racism. To feign compliance with the legal doctrine of separate but equal, 16 states authorized the use of public tax dollars for its Black residents to go out of state to pursue post-baccalaureate degree programs that were available in-state to white residents. Usually, states paid the difference between the tuition where Black Southerners studied and the tuition at the flagship institutions that Black Southerners could not attend because of racism. I refer to these funds that states appropriated for Black citizens' graduate and professional school training as segregation scholarships, since the entire point of the tuition assistance was to preserve segregation. Missouri introduced the idea of appropriating money to send Black citizens out of state for graduate training in 1921 and finally allocated funds 8 years later. Between 1921 and 1948, 15 other states set up their own system of providing scholarships to Black students to study out of state. Georgia's segregation scholarship program began in 1944. Many of these states paid for their segregation scholarship programs by taking money from their already underfunded public Black colleges. When I first started this project and would tell people about it, their response was always, well, that doesn't seem so bad. These students had the opportunity to study at some of the best institutions in the world. And I would have to remind them that, number one, these students were compelled to leave their home communities and their families in search of the graduate training that white students, Native American students, Asian students, and Hispanic students were able to receive locally. I also had to remind them that the North was not this promised land. These institutions that the students are studying at in the North, Midwest, and West did not roll out the proverbial welcome mat. Such was the case for John Hope Franklin. Franklin was in the first wave of African American Southerners to benefit from segregation scholarships. He received $100 from his native state of Oklahoma to offset expenses at Harvard University during the 1935-1936 academic year. And from 1935 until 1941, Franklin would receive $100 per year from the state of Oklahoma. Franklin remarked that he found Harvard to be a socially challenging place for Black students. He later recalled, and I quote, that a day and often an hour didn't go by without my feeling the color of my skin. In the reactions of white Cambridge, the behavior of my fellow students, the attitudes, real and imagined, struck by my professors, end quote. Racial slights at the Ivy League institution were not simply perceived. In a class where John Hope Franklin was the only black student, he endured the professor telling a darky joke without shame. Persevering in an anti-black space, Franklin mastered the historian's craft of interpreting the past, as evidenced by his seminal work From Slavery to Freedom, which exposed the contradictions at the center of our nation's founding. And let me just say that From Slavery to Freedom is still in print. It's like, I believe, in the 14th edition. My father, that was his history textbook when he was in college at Winston-Salem State University in the 70s. That was my textbook when I was in college years later. Franklin's experience at Harvard was not an anomaly. Christine King Ferris, the older sister of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., was a segregation scholarship recipient from Georgia. After graduating from Spelman College in 1948 with a degree in economics, she matriculated in the economics graduate program at Columbia University. In several interviews, Christine King Ferris said she wanted to go to UGA. She wanted to go to UGA and get a master's in economics. Her parents were Georgia taxpayers, yet she could not attend the University of Georgia because of racism. So she receives a segregation scholarship to go to Columbia. She quickly learned that Columbia was no promised land. Years later, she asserted that her first semester there was the worst time of her life. While the library was second to none and the campus was full of manicured lawns and perfectly placed trees, she found the classroom to be hostile. As a graduate student in economics at Columbia, she was the only black student and the only woman in her classes. One of her professors, a white male, never acknowledged her raised hand or answered her questions. Those who received out-of-state funding routinely faced racial discrimination and social ostracism while studying at institutions outside of the South. After they graduated, these same institutions refused to hire them. As scholars have pointed out, historical narratives of the Great Migration, narratives of black Southerners leaving the South for the North, tend to obscure the entrenched realities of Northern racism. Professional school study in law and medicine were also popular paths for segregation scholarship recipients. And while I'm not going to talk about him tonight, Dr. Lewis Sullivan, the founder of Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, was a segregation scholarship recipient from the state of Georgia. Tonight, with respect to professional school study, I want to talk about one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in our nation's history, Attorney Fred Gray, who is still practicing law in Montgomery, Alabama today. He's been practicing now for over 70 years. Gray grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and matriculated at Alabama State Teachers College in 1947, where he joined Omega Psi Phi fraternity. Conversations with professors about civil rights led him to pursue law. He applied to several law schools outside of the state of Alabama, since the University of Alabama's law school was off limits to him. Alabama's segregation scholarship program operated on a reimbursement basis. So students had to come up with the full amount of their tuition and then submit a receipt and receive the difference paid back to them as a reimbursement. With the support of family and friends, Gray secured the necessary funds and matriculated at what is today Case Western Reserve School of Law in Cleveland, Ohio, where he studied from 1951 until 1954. Though he and his relatives paid taxes to support graduate and professional school programs at the University of Alabama, segregation compelled him to leave his home state and study elsewhere. Recalling his decision to leave the state in pursuit of a legal career, Gray reminisced, and I quote, "Privately, I pledged that I would return to Montgomery and use the law to destroy everything segregated that I could find. I kept my plans secret. I did not want anything to interfere with my going to law school." End quote. Gray would go on to be a nationally known attorney who used his knowledge of the law to overturn black voter dilution and dismantle racial segregation in various arenas. He represented Rosa Parks when she was arrested on a Montgomery City bus in December of 1955. He also represented the men and their families involved in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, and he filed the lawsuits that integrated all state institutions of higher learning in Alabama and 104 of the then 121 elementary and secondary school systems in the state. In the book, I argue that segregation scholarships not only created all of these unnecessary obstacles for segregation scholarship recipients, but the program also created a twofold debt owed to public black colleges. First, the states of Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Florida paid for their segregation scholarship programs by taking money out of the already underfunded public black colleges. For example, in Tennessee, lawmakers created a segregation scholarship program after William Redmond, a 27-year-old black man, applied for admission to the University of Tennessee's pharmacy school in 1936. The university rejected his application on the basis of race, and Redmond then sued for admission. One direct result of his lawsuit was that the Tennessee legislature created a segregation scholarship program in 1937. The authorizing legislation for the program detailed that scholarships were, and I quote, payable out of the state appropriations made for the Agricultural and Industrial College for Negroes, end quote. So Tennessee A&I is present-day Tennessee State University. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, legislators placed the burden of financing African Americans out-of-state graduate study on already cash-strapped public black colleges. You all might recall that in 2023, the Biden administration found that the state of Tennessee owed Tennessee State University $2.1 billion, billion with a B, from 1987 until 2020. So for a 30-year period, right, the Biden administration said the state of Tennessee had underfunded Tennessee State by $2.1 billion. And I remember when this news broke, because lots of people were texting me. And when I saw that, I said, well, why did they start in 1987? Because we could go back to 1937, when Tennessee started its segregation scholarship program. And I'm a historian. I'm not an economist or a mathematician, but just based on my numbers, without taking into account compounded interest, if we account for Tennessee's segregation scholarship program, which ran for 30 years, the state of Tennessee owes Tennessee State at least $8 billion. So today, when we see that Tennessee State has some financial challenges, we can't blame that on poor leadership. We can't blame that on a rogue president stealing money. And I can tell you that Glenda Glover was not stealing money. What we know is that the state of Tennessee has systematically underfunded that institution for years. Tennessee State could have new buildings. They could have more dorms. They could hire more faculty if the state would pay the institution what it owes. And that's a similar story. I could tell you the numbers on FAMU. I could tell you the numbers on A&T. I could tell you the numbers on the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff. Many of these states that paid for their segregation scholarship programs by taking money out of public black colleges have a debt that they refuse to pay. And the problems that we see many of these institutions dealing with in 2025 are a direct result of these schemes to preserve segregation. The other reason why I say that there is that Southern and border state governments owe a debt to public black colleges is because they could have established graduate and professional school programs at these institutions. If you know anything about academia, you know that it's really graduate and professional school programs that are revenue generating programs. Medical schools, law schools, pharmacy schools, master's degree programs, PhD programs, those are programs that can bring in revenue for an institution. And for decades, many public black colleges were denied the opportunity to have graduate and professional school programs. So when we begin to look at disparities between the physical plant and disparities in the endowment of a UGA versus an Albany State or a Fort Valley, it's not rocket science. We can see where there has been such a systemic denial of or under-resourcing of these institutions. So as I close, let me assert that the practice of compelling black students to leave home to secure the same opportunities provided to white students locally should be understood as a form of racism just as pernicious and evil as racial violence. Like lynching and disfranchisement, segregation scholarships maintained white supremacy. We can point to segregationist governors who stood in schoolhouse doors or law enforcement officials who turned hoses on innocent children and easily label those actions as problematic and racist without difficulty. We must not, however, ignore the polite forms of racism that were maintained by bureaucracy and designed to preserve the racial status quo of white superiority and black inferiority. We must not forget the silent bystanders who propped up the racist exploitation of black talent by refusing to speak up and say that the arrangement was unjust, unnecessary, and downright ludicrous. By making their personal peace with segregationist scholarships as a middle ground, even the most well-meaning white officials embraced the idea that there was something so different and wrong with black people that required them to be educated elsewhere. Let this be a lesson for all of us today to bear witness to what has happened in the past and fight and resist inequality in any form in the present. Thank you.
So let's once again show our appreciation to both of our recipients. So as Joe comes forward to moderate the Q&A session, I have a question that's occasioned by reading both of your books. And that is, you know, we many of us know the story of Horace Ward, you know, who after being denied admission to the University of Georgia Law School, sued the school for discrimination. Many of us know that the suit took a number of years, and many of us know that the suit was eventually dismissed because it was moot, because by the time his motion was heard, he had already received a degree from Northwestern. The question that's occasioned by these books is, who paid for that degree? Do we know?
I believe his funding was actually, if I remember correctly, I'd have to go back into the archives. There was a group of NAACP lawyers who paid for, there was a pool of money used for plaintiffs in many of these cases. And I believe he got money from there. I don't believe he was a segregation scholarship recipient. I've never seen him on any list from Georgia. But there were several, like the same thing with the case of Donald Murray out of Maryland.
Okay.
In that case, the NAACP lawyers, in conjunction with Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, paid for his tuition rather than receiving a segregation scholarship, because they did not want taking the segregation scholarship to hurt their legal challenges.
Okay.
So they found a way to pay for them.
Are there other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Sanders, I'd like to know whether your book has been, how your book has been received. You heard, gotten calls, requests from administrators at HBCUs or at systems where, like the university system of Georgia or other places to kind of talk about the money that you're saying is due.
So I've had informal conversations with faculty and administrators at HBCUs, and typically I say, tell your alumni to go look in the archive and get a legal research team, and the documents are there. In a more organized fashion, I just recently started, surprisingly, the UNCF called me in to talk about this, even though when we think of the UNCF, we think of private institutions. But they're doing a lot of work with Thurgood Marshall Foundation, so they called me in. So that has just started recently, like in late July, early August, I began having conversations with them. Surprisingly, many of the institutions that have reached out to me were institutions that were popular destinations for segregation scholarship recipients. So two of the most popular destinations were the University of Michigan and Teachers College, Columbia University. And both of those institutions have tried to acknowledge what role they played in propping up the system of segregation. So they've been really eager to try to track how many segregation scholarship recipients they were receiving every year, and to acknowledge that they were a party to this, right? Because they could have said, well, we're not going to admit you because we're going to help you on a lawsuit to get your flagship institution to admit black students. So there has been some acknowledgement by those two institutions of trying to show just how much, or figure out just how much money they got from southern state governments.
Other questions? Anybody?
Hold on for the talking stick.
There's a mic coming around. There's a mic coming.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There you go.
Sorry. Professor Cohen, I really enjoyed your presentation, very powerful. Just as, this is not really a question, it's more an FYI, but it does relate to the ongoing challenges that we face as a country. I was surprised to learn recently that the African American student population at the University of Georgia is currently 8% of the total student population there. We live in a state, 30% of our residents are African American. This is a glaring reality. And so what are your thoughts on changing those numbers at the flagship institution in Georgia?
Well, one thing I want to say is that what's really bad, when you think about it historically, is that UGA desegregated because the federal courts were more progressive than the university. In other words, they were court ordered. Now, I'm not going to say Georgia's great, but it flipped. The federal courts threw out affirmative action. And now we know what's, getting rid of DEI and all that. So the problem is that the main tools for desegregation have been taken away from the university. There are some scholars who are advocating other ways to get around this, like not linking it specifically to race, but if you are a descendant of someone who's enslaved. In other words, there are other arguments that aren't necessarily purely racial that can get around for this. But to me, as I say at the end of my book, it's like a shell game. For centuries, you discriminated on the basis of race, and now you're colorblind, so you can't use race as a criteria to help rectify the situation. So, and I just want to say too, that I don't have, the solution is obviously to use class on top of race to get people in. But I just want to say that it seems to me that there's such a distortion going on of what, say, Dr. King was saying about, the right will take one line from MLK's I Have a Dream speech about not having people judged by the content of their character, by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character, acting as if King was advocating being blind to racism. When in fact, the whole reason he gave that speech was to get, part of it was to get the federal government to intervene by passing the Civil Rights Act. And King talked about the GI Bill as being a great precedent, because there you had service men and women who had been abroad, so they'd been denied that opportunity for 4 or 5 years during World War II. And you think about how that compares to being enslaved for centuries and then going through Jim Crow. So he was a big advocate. And he also cited the Marshall Plan. He was a big advocate of, rectifying this through technically not being ahistorical, but looking at the historical legacy, because people accumulate property and they pass it on to their descendants. So what I'm saying is the problem is the courts, have no kind of historical, they intentionally erasing the history so that we all start at the same point and there's no need to rectify the past, because that's discriminatory. So I'm just saying the tools are really, that universities have been limited, and then, I think what's been going on lately is that even to promote diversity is now you want to fire people for that. So I don't think this is going to last. I hope it's not going to last, but I'm just saying that what you're talking about is going to get worse unless there's different leadership, that things are topsy-turvy now. And they've convinced themselves, not anybody who's actually serious about history, that being anti-discrimination is discriminatory against white people. Which is just absurd. Even when they made the decision in Georgia, the district court flipped 20 years ago, saying that you had to, and these were some white students who had to get in and sued, the black population was tiny. So, what's the problem? You want to go from like 94% to 99%? So I just want to say one other thing too. I know you didn't ask about this, but this irritates me no end. That a lot of the way that people talk about DEI hires is exactly the same way, just different terms, exactly the same assumptions that guided the ignoramuses I studied at Georgia in '61. The assumption, that a black student doesn't belong here, only here because the federal courts forced this on us. And I just want to say that's part of the roots of the problem. that actually nobody in white leadership in Georgia, in the political system, would say that what segregation was wrong, it was unjust, it was ripping people off, the black community off. They never said that. They said, and they complained, the big bad federal government is forcing us to integrate. So what I'm saying is, part of the foundation of this problem is that there was never a kind of recognition of what was wrong with that system. You know, you might honor Charlene and Hamilton and the other black pioneers, but you won't talk about what was wrong in the first place. You know, like they had a big celebration honoring the courage of the first black students at the University of Georgia, but not why it took courage to go to the University of Georgia. and this is a real problem. You know, in a way, and this is what I was trying to imply, the South, and the whole, not just the South, you know, it's the whole country, has never honestly faced what was wrong with that system. And that you forget about you know, it's basically theft. You're taking tax money from people in the black community, and you're not using it to subsidize the university to go and educate them, which is what Crystal's book is about. And you can't really rectify that situation until you pay the HBCUs what they're owed. And so what I'm saying to you, you're making a really good point, but I don't see it until we actually have some kind of reconciliation, you know, some kind of honesty about what's owed, and not that we just have everybody will discriminate if we try to deal with the past injustice and its legacy, then, you know, it's not a problem that's going to be solvable. And Georgia is not unique. Almost every single state university in the South, and you know, I don't want to just pick on the South. I mean, a lot of times the number of black students is artificially inflated, including at my university, because of taking into account international students. So, you know, I just feel as if I wish I could give you a solution, but I'm saying there's not going to be a solution when you have people who are, you know, getting into federal power, you know, like the Senate and the President, by appealing to white resentment. And resentment of what? One final thing I just want to say is the University of Georgia is a much better institution today because it is integrated, even as poorly integrated as it has. I mean, I think about like the fact that W. Du Bois was at AU for years and years and never set foot at the University of Georgia. Instead, they had Ebert and Coulter, who nobody reads this stuff because it's polluted by racism. So, you know, or think about another example that always strikes me. The jazz club at the University of Georgia was going to invite David Brubeck, the quartet, to play at Georgia. But they disinvited him when they found out the bass player was black. And Ralph Leeson, you know, the great jazz critic and founder of Rolling Stone, said in response, he wrote a column urging a boycott of all jazz musicians should not play at the University of Georgia. And he said, who do they think plays jazz? Eugene Talmadge? Anyway, sorry to go on.
Another question. Another question. Well, yes, sir. Oh, nothing.
I wonder, you talked about the pressure that universities are under right now, and and the policies that are trying to undo DEI, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about? I mean, both of you are obviously writing about race and racism. Can you talk a little bit about how you're navigating? I'm trying to ask this diplomatically. How you're navigating those kinds of pressures.
I mean, you know, I'm a faculty member in the Department of African American Studies at Emory, and we remain committed to doing our jobs, which is to give our students a well-rounded education that prepares them to think critically, that prepares them to be able to express themselves coherently, and that gives them a knowledge of the past that helps them to understand the world in which they live in. And that our game plan is not changing, right? I mean, yes, there's perhaps more microscopes on what we do. I still teach my courses the same way I've always taught them, because I feel like I have a duty to teach my students the truth, as Lillian Smith or Ida B. Wells said the truth freely, right? I can't change. I'm a historian, so I can't change the narrative. I have to have some fidelity to my archives, and so that means really I'm doing the same things I've always done. I think on some part, students are hesitant to take courses that are seen as having anything to do with Black history or African American studies, with the fear that perhaps that being on their transcript might hinder them from getting a job or make it harder to get a job. But we continue to stress the benefits of taking our courses, right? And to make sense of the current moment we're in. So, I think that's really perhaps one of the biggest challenges for faculty in African American studies programs, and really, frankly, even in history, in liberal arts departments right now, right? This idea that there's so many people watching what's said that students are just not interested in perhaps going down a minefield. But really, our game plan has not changed. I can speak for my colleagues. We don't teach opinions. We teach fact, right? And we help our students to understand the world in which they live. And that can't change no matter who's in the White House.
I would just add that my view, and I've been influenced by all my years studying student radicals like Mario Savio. We regard the university, or I regard the university, and a lot of people in the 60s did, we're the university. We are, the faculty and the students. The administration, this is a 60s perspective, they're supposed to keep the lights on, and the sidewalks clean. They're not supposed to tell us what to do. And so I don't care if people don't like what I say. What's the point of getting tenure? And I'm old, so what are they going to do to me? I feel as if when I see this is like in some ways an age of cowardice. You have billionaires, and by the way, Calvin Trilly, he's a humorist. He talked about his wife Alice talked about the problem. This is years ago in Millikan. The problem with some of these billionaires is they don't have a concept of enoughness. Nothing is ever enough. But what I'm saying is, I don't have responsibility for pleasing donors or pleasing trustees. My obligation, just like Crystal said, is to the truth. And by the way, that's also why I feel as if despite all of the power and all the bullshit that's coming out, pardon me for saying that, from the Trump administration, it's not going to work on the university. Because they can pressure administrators, but they're not going to change the way history gets written unless they can find people, an army of people who replace people like me and Crystal, who are looking for the truth, that people who want to glorify the past like a Madison Avenue advertising agent to talk about how hot the country is. You're not going to find 1,000 graduate students who are going to do that. You're not going to find 10 graduate students who are going to do that. So I think that's going to fail as an intellectual project. Sure, you can always pressure administrators because they're answerable to boards of trustees and fat cats who are, there's money involved in that. But I'm not pressured like that. In other words, I don't care. I haven't censored, on some of the things I've done. I don't care. I mean, what I'm here for is to try to illuminate the past and try to make America a more decent and inclusive and humane society. And if you're opposed to that, that's your right. Your free speech right to oppose that. But okay, we can talk about it. If I offend you, this is another thing. They're afraid that these laws about, they're not talking about racism, you might upset white people. Okay, well, let's have a conversation with my students. If you're upset, that's a teachable moment. Why are you upset? And then, that's part of education, right? So what I'm just saying is I don't mean to make light of it, is that our mission is to respond to this stuff. And I'm willing to, and David Blight had this thing, he wanted to debate, this Yale biographer, he wanted to debate with these right-wingers about, let's take a look at why we need to study the history of slavery and Jim Crow. And so I'm just saying, there are pressure, it's a good question, but that pressure is really most successful on administrators. And they're not the university. They're just about keeping the lights on and the sidewalks. That's my view. We're the university. And they're not the university.
So let me just say again what Joe said before, that the copies of books are available for sale, for purchase, outside, and I believe our authors will be available outside as well to sign.
Yes, the cork boat regatta has been cleaned up.
Okay, all right. Well, we want to thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next year. And let's give one more round of appreciation to both of our recipients.